Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, September the 11th, 2024. I have got some bad news. There are going to be no forecasts for the 12 signs in this video, and for the reason for that is that there was a technical problem, and so I made this video and just finished it and I realized there's no sound. And so I have to start again. And I can't do a full 2-hour video, so I'm going to have to cut something out. So I made a decision to cut out the 12 signs. So if you want to know about today, what's happening today, you're going to have to rely on my overview of the astrological picture, geocentrically and heliocentrically. And also you might want to look at the I Ching. So the I Ching, I'm looking at what is happening today. So that might be something you want to consider. Now, as far as the main topic is concerned, I know everyone is thinking that it's the anniversary of 9/11. So 9/11 happened, 23 years ago. But, one sometimes forgets that there was another 9/11. There was a 9/11 on September the 11th, 1973, when the democratically elected government of Chile, in the form of President Salvador Allende, was overthrown in a military coup. And this military coup was supported by the US. And in the aftermath of this coup, there were horrendous human rights violations. Thousands and thousands of people were arrested, were kept in the national stadium. They say 30,000 people were tortured. There was a caravan of death whereby they went in helicopters going from prison to prison, taking political prisoners and throwing them out of helicopters, dumping them in volcanoes. And it was all supported by the US. The US had been systematically working to undermine Chile. I think from 1963 until 1973, and particularly right at the end. And of course, 1973, you had Nixon was the US president, and I think the Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And so this is a real showcase of what America can do at its very worst. And to give you an idea, Henry Kissinger, when talking about the coup, he said, I think we should understand our policy, that however unpleasant they act, this government is better for us than Allende was. And there was a general who was quite shocked by the treatment of the army of political prisoners, and he said, I was ashamed to see them. They were torn into pieces. So I wanted to put them together, at least leave them in a human form. Yes, their eyes were gouged out with knives, their jaws broken, their legs broken. At the end, they gave them the coup de grace. They were merciless. The prisoners were killed so that they would die slowly. So, this happened 51 years ago, and I think I need to say something about that. But before I do that, I want to look at what's happening today from a perspective of the astrology and the I Ching. And if you like this video, I would be happy if you were to like it. But still, I understand you might not like it because there's no forecast of the 12 signs. And don't worry, next video, this is just a temporary one-off. It won't happen again. And so still, if you do like it, I would be grateful. And if you're not subscribed and you were to subscribe, I would be really, really grateful. So let's start off by turning to what's happening today. So today on September the 11th, 2024. So by the way, the picture's up there. That's on the left. That's Augusto Pinochet, the military leader who took over in this coup, who's responsible for numerous and horrendous human rights violations. And you've got Salvador Allende, the president, who died defending the palace, supposedly. I mean, he might have committed suicide. And of course, I do understand, by the way, that a lot of people think that it was a good thing for this coup to have happened. A lot of people in Chile think it was a good thing. So people on the right thinking that Marxism is a terrible idea and that Pinochet saved the country. There is that view, I understand, but that was no excuse for the human rights violations. And that's a helicopter, by the way, because just a reminder that it was the caravan of death where people were rounded up, put in helicopters and dropped to their deaths. So as far as what's happening today, and you are going to have to rely on this because there's no forecast for the 12 signs. The moon continues to move through Sagittarius. So this moon, we got a first quarter moon, and so the moon in Sagittarius is square the sun, and I think it's a time when there is quite a lot of action. We want action. There's a certain dynamism in the air, and we really want things to happen. I think we want excitement. But I suppose when you've got moon in Sagittarius square sun in Virgo, there is a certain sense that sun in Virgo could be about maybe responsibility and things that we have to do, things that we maybe don't want to do, but we're going to do them anyway. And then moon in Sagittarius, we perhaps don't like that. We want to be free. And the moon opposition Jupiter, there is that sense that we have to perhaps do something to just stir things up. But moon opposition Jupiter can be a little, how shall I put it, excessive, can take things too far. Maybe what we say can be taken too far. Our expenditure can be taken too far. We might say things that maybe cause offence. So it's important, not to exaggerate and to have a certain sense of responsibility. I mean, I think we can have a sense of responsibility because Venus is quincunx Saturn. So remember, Venus and Saturn are in mutual reception by exaltation. Venus is in the exaltation of Saturn, in Venus in Libra, and Saturn is in the exaltation of Venus because Venus is exalted in Pisces. And so Venus quincunx Saturn, in terms of relationships, it's really worth trying hard. We don't perhaps automatically get on with people. It's not entirely easy, but if we make the effort, we try very hard to be considerate, if we can try to read the signals, we can work hard to make things work on a social and from a social and relationship point of view. Now, turning to the heliocentric point of view, which is where you put the sun at the center of the solar system, we see that the main aspect here is Venus opposition Uranus. Venus is exactly opposition Uranus, and Venus is opposition Mars as well. And I kind of think that gives us extra information maybe about that Venus quincunx Saturn that I've just talked about. So geocentrically, Venus quincunx Saturn, there are certainly things that we need to attend to in terms of dealing with other people. We need to make sure that we behave correctly. Just because we don't entirely get on with someone doesn't mean that there is scope for some kind of an understanding there. And Venus opposition Uranus, there is a tension there. We might do things that upset people. They might do things that upset us. So, whoever we are, whoever we're dealing with, we've got to really try hard to make sure that we behave correctly and that we show really as much understanding as possible. So I think that Venus opposition Uranus, Venus opposition Mars, does indicate that, in terms of other people, there is work to be done. And, we mustn't freak out if other people do things we're not expecting. And by the same token, we must make sure that our own behavior is as reasonable and as considerate as is possible. But, sometimes it's necessary to make a fuss. There's no way around it. So that's the heliocentric picture, and now I want to look at today from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 49, which is revolution. So when the I Ching talks about revolution, it's not talking about just the destruction of things for the sake of it. It's talking about something needing to be changed. You have to sometimes change a structure in order to maintain the overall order. And so if something isn't working, you have to accept this, even for the sake of wider harmony. And so we cannot be satisfied with the way things are, and we have to consider how change can best be engineered. Now, this hexagram 49 revolution does have 3 moving lines. Now, the first line moves, the bottom line moves. And when you've got the bottom line moving, that does indicate that, yes, change is required. We do want to have our revolution, but we have to get our timing right. And it seems that the timing may not be right, but we do have to be patient. Just people are not ready. And so if we try to engineer a dramatic change right now, it might not happen. And, when I'm talking about revolution, you think about it's us against other people. It may be an internal revolution. It's about us trying to change ourselves, perhaps trying to get rid of bad habits or to bring in good habits. We think now is a time for a big change, but it may not quite be the right time. There may be too much inner resistance there. Now, we do get 2 more moving lines. The 5th line moves and the 6th line moves. Now, the 5th line moves. Now, that 5th line is a really important line. It's saying that we change. We change into a tiger and we become someone else. And it just happens almost before the question is asked. So we're aware of this change. We're aware of how we are changing and how we can really transform everything. So things are looking good. But the question is, as you move into the 6th line, how well do people understand this? So if we talk to other people about what we want to do, what we want to achieve, they might say, yeah, fine, that's a good idea. Yeah. Nodding away. But how sincere are they? And I think that when it actually comes to the crunch, people are not really ready for a revolution. They say they are, but they're not. And so we may not get the support we need. And this applies in the same way to any internal revolution we might be considering. We might be telling ourselves, I'm going to change. I'm going to change my diet, change my exercise program. I'm going to study more. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to get my work-life balance in order, whatever. But you have the big idea, but there's so many parts of ourselves and our unconscious that just don't want to do it. And so it may actually be hard work to engineer this revolution. Although I think we should be working towards change, whatever that change might be. Now, because we got 3 moving lines, we move to a 2nd hexagram. And that 2nd hexagram is hexagram number 56, which is the Wanderer. And perhaps this is telling us that if we want real change, we can't have it on home ground. It's too familiar. People are too familiar with us. We're too familiar with ourselves. And when we're in the same place, you can't get change. If you want real change, you have to go somewhere else. And you perhaps have to be a wanderer. You have to move into new territory, new places that we're not familiar with. It may be places which, geographically, going somewhere else. It may be places in our minds, in our imagination. But whatever it is, we have to be a wanderer, and perhaps we have to leave our comfort zone if we want to create genuine change. So that's I Ching. I hope that makes some sense in terms of what is happening today. And again, my apologies for not having anything for the 12 signs. So I now want to look at the coup in Chile, which was 51 years ago. So let's start off by looking at the horoscope of the coup. So this coup happened at 6 o'clock. Well, I think 6 o'clock is a possible time. 6 o'clock in the morning in Valparaiso. Valparaiso is obviously not the Chilean capital, but it's I think it's the second city. I think it's a naval base, and so I think that the Navy started to take over Valparaiso at around 6 in the morning on September the 11th, 1973. And so as far as what was going on at the time of the beginning of the coup, Saturn was square Pluto. So look at that Saturn. Saturn was in Cancer, conjunct the South Node, not great. Saturn is in its detriment in Cancer. I mean, Saturn in Cancer is very much about tradition, conservatism. Conjunct the South Node, is this the right way to be going? Sort of the conservative general revolting against a Marxist president. Maybe that's Saturn conjunct the South Node. And then you've got Saturn conjunct the South Node square Pluto, Saturn square Pluto. It's difficult times, 1973. It was you had the oil crisis, 1973. You had the 1973, the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. So it was unstable. That was a world that we were living in, I was 11 at the time, but we were in then, if you happened to be alive in 1973. And so perhaps the coup was picking up on that Saturn-Pluto square. So if you're trying to understand an event, or perhaps trying to forecast an event, it's often useful to look at the new moon just beforehand. So looking at the new moon, the prenatal new moon relocated to Santiago, which is the capital of Chile. So August 27th, 1973, here is a new moon for just before the coup, August 27th, 1973. You can see that Mars is rising. So that might just give you a hint. So when you see a new moon, Mars rising, a hint that something might happen. But I'm not saying that it's absolutely for sure telling us that it was Chile where it was going to happen. I mean, you can actually do astrocartography for that, and if you do an astrocartography for it, there's Chile for the Sept, this new moon, and there's the Mars conjunct, right, that yellow line here. I mean, there's Santiago up there. I think Valparaiso is up here. So it doesn't go through Valparaiso. It doesn't go through Santiago, but it certainly goes through Chile. So there might be a hint there. Now, I do think that this lunation is quite significant in terms of the power. That new moon was at 441 Virgo. So that new moon at 441 Virgo was square Neptune at 442 Sagittarius. So you had an exact new moon square Neptune then. And so something is happening under the surface. There's a lot of deception there. And it's more than that. When you look at the midpoints on that new moon, that new moon was squaring the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And in fact, you had Uranus on the Sun-Moon midpoint, and you had Neptune on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Remember, in astrology, Mars-Saturn is about, it can be about death. It is the death pair. And what we can do is we can look at this new moon from the perspective of the 90-degree dial. So remember, when you've got a 90-degree dial, you're treating conjunctions, oppositions, and squares as conjunctions, and semisquares and sesquiquadrates as oppositions. So if we take this new moon and we put Neptune and the Sun and the Moon on the midpoint, so on the dial, on the arrow, there you can see the Saturn-Pluto together. The Saturn-Pluto, they are in square, but it becomes a conjunction on the 90-degree dial, and there is Mars. So Mars, the Mars-Pluto, Mars-Saturn midpoint. So that new moon it's quite a vicious new moon. I think you can see that with new moon on the Mars-Saturn, on the Mars-Pluto midpoint, and also the fact that the new moon is conjunct Neptune and opposition Uranus. So that is the coup. And the victim of the coup was the elected president, who was Salvador Allende. And here is the horoscope of Salvador Allende. And he was born on June 26, 1908 at 1:30 a.m. Load of Cancer in his chart. You know, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. We got 5 planets in Cancer. Maybe he loved his country. I mean, I suppose if you're on the right, you might think that what he did for his country in terms of wanting a Marxist revolution is not the right way for the country to go. But that's what was important to him. And so that's his chart. He has a Uranus-Neptune opposition and Saturn in Aries. Saturn in Aries is not great. Saturn in Aries is it? Saturn is in its fall. There's something rather unfortunate about it. And Saturn in, if you're into whole sign houses, Saturn in Aries in the first house. I know it's in the 12th Placidus, but it's in whole sign Saturn in Aries. So that's Allende's chart. So then the question is, what was going on for Allende when it happened? So what transits did he have? So at the time of the coup, there was Saturn was conjunct the South Node at 3-4 Cancer. So he had Saturn conjunct his Sun, South Node conjunct his Sun, and he also had in his natal chart South Node conjunct the North Node. So the South Node, he had the South Node hitting his North Node, Saturn conjunct his Sun. So that's kind of not great, really, is it? Plus, Uranus is pretty close to his descendant. I mean, that is a standard signature of, being murdered. It can be, or death by the mob, or even being killed in a revolution. And so that transit seemed to really sort of hit him quite hard. And then his solar returns are also pretty impressive. So here is his solar return for 1973. So his solar return for 1973, you compare it with his natal chart. The solar return had Saturn conjunct the South Node, had Sun conjunct the South Node, and Mars. Look at that Sun conjunct Mars. When you look at solar aspects. So when he has his solar return, there was Sun. Yeah, Sun was exactly square Mars. So it was a strong solar return. And let me just look at this solar return compared to his natal chart. So so here is his. Hold on, this is Salvador Allende, and there we have it. Okay, so at the time of his solar return, a couple of months before the coup, Sun conjunct South Node conjunct his Sun conjunct the North Node. Obviously, the Sun is always going to conjunct the Sun during a solar return, but you can see the nodal aspect. Plus, look at Mars. Mars was square his. So when you got Sun square Mars in a solar return, that is an indication that something really quite bad could happen. So I do think that does work very well. What about his converse solar return? So converse solar return is the coup happened when he was 65 years old. So you go 65 years before he was born. So you go 65 years before he was born, and that takes you to his solar return for June 26, 1843. And so there was a Saturn-Pluto square at the time of the coup. And there was 65 years after he was born. 65 years before he was born, there was also a Saturn-Pluto square. And there you have it. There's Saturn in that solar return on a descendant square Pluto. So those solar returns for Salvador Allende were really, really deadly. Now, what about the person who overthrew him? Augusto Pinochet. So Augusto Pinochet, he's got Uranus conjunct the North Node. I suppose you could say that his destiny to have a revolution, his destiny to lead a coup, that's Uranus conjunct the North Node. North Node is the way you're supposed to be going to. Uranus is a planet of revolution, so I suppose in a way that makes sense, doesn't it? And also it's a Sagittarius. Sagittarius. What's Sagittarius about? Free thinking, supposedly. Likes variety, action. But, you know, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter is a very moralistic sign. Sagittarians can be moralistic, and they can want things done in a particular way. He was a Catholic conservative, I think. Very, very traditional, part of the old order. Sagittarius, having strong feelings about it. He might have been able to keep these secrets to himself up to a point. Allende sort of trusted him. Allende actually made him chief of the army, and he trusted Pinochet. But no, Pinochet had to do that Uranus conjunct the North Node. But also he was conservative, and he was traditional, and he thought tradition was important. And just another example of a chart of someone who was a Sagittarius was the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. So here is Francisco Franco's chart, Sun in Sagittarius, 12. So we have to perhaps think again about, you know, what it means perhaps to be a Sagittarius. Now, the country where the coup took place was Chile. And here's the horoscope for Chile, or it's a horoscope for Chile. Chile has its Independence Day on September the 18th. So I'm going for that. There may be other days one can choose, but I suppose in the popular consciousness, that's the day to give a chart to go for. And so here is Chile's chart, and there is something in stone saying that there was some important congress that started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I've seen from another source that independence itself happened at 9:26 in the morning. So I've decided to go for 9:26 as the time for when Chile came into being. And no, the dog is barking, by the way, because there is a deer. I can see a deer out there, and deer just drive the dog crazy. So I'm sorry about that, but a deer is just standing there being provocative. So Neptune is, if we take 9:26 a.m. as, if we take 9:26 a.m. as being the beginning of when Chile made its declaration of independence, so you've got Neptune rising, and so the question would be, you know, what was happening to Chile at the time of the coup? So here are the transits. So Chile actually had its Neptune return around the time of the coup, and Neptune was on its ascendant, and Neptune was conjunct its Neptune was opposition its moon Jupiter conjunction. By the way, Salvador Allende had the moon in Gemini, quite close to Chile's moon. So there was a natural rapport that Salvador Allende had with his country, which perhaps enabled him to get elected. You know, he apparently is the only elected Marxist leader in the history of Latin America. And so there's Neptune. The Sun is on the midheaven. No, the Sun is not on the midheaven. The Sun is on the 11th house cusp. It was, with that chart format, kind of looks like the 10th house cusp, but it's not. So Sun was on the 11th. So not much going on there. But I think it's at this Neptune, and so that's what's happening with Chile. Now, when we think about Chile and this coup, we have to also think about outside forces. There were other people getting involved with Chile. America wanted to bring to an end the presidency of Salvador Allende. Not because they really cared about Chilean people, but because they cared about it from a strategic point of view. And Salvador Allende was talking about nationalizing the copper mines, and of course Chile is a big copper producer, and so Chile wanted, so America, wanted to take over, or at least wanted to create a situation where you had an America-friendly government. So at the time, Kissinger was the Secretary of State. So here's Kissinger. So Kissinger has his sun at 4 degrees 52 Gemini. So if you look at Kissinger and Chile, what impact does Kissinger have on Chile? So there is Kissinger's sun exactly on Chile's descendant. So the descendant represents the other person, the adversary, and so perhaps that's Kissinger. I suppose some Chileans would say he's not an adversary, but he sort of gets under Chile's skin with his Gemini sun on Chile's descendant, also on Chile's moon. So you can see potentially how Kissinger could have had a big impact on Chile. And Kissinger, going back to Kissinger's chart, what kind of person was he? I mean, he was always the power behind the throne, certainly in terms of foreign policy. He was the eminence grise, perhaps, leading America's foreign policy, perhaps not being always out in the open, but he was pulling the strings. And that kind of connects with his sun in Gemini in the 12th house. I mean, it's a Gemini, but it is the sun in Gemini, but it's not immediately obvious. But there's, very brilliant mind, thinking, scheming, and planning, and working out, what to do next. And this is kind of emphasized when you look at Kissinger's chart. What transits Kissinger had at the time of the coup. So Kissinger had his sun at 4:52 Gemini. Neptune, on the day of the coup, was at 4:51 Sagittarius, which is quite impressive, isn't it? There's the eminence grise working behind the scenes, but he gets his results. There's Neptune. Notice Chiron. He had a Chiron return at the time. What does that tell you about Chiron? Chiron, you think about Chiron as being the maverick, the healer. But maybe, as in tarot cards, you can reverse a tarot card. Maybe you can reverse Chiron. Maybe we're seeing a dark side of Chiron. He thinks he's healing. He thinks he's helping. But of course, he's, being involved in something which leads to horrific destruction, horrific human rights abuses. So maybe that's how Chiron is working. Maybe it's Chiron in Aries. Of course, it's America. It's all about America, isn't it? So let's look at America's chart. So that's the United States' chart. And remember, America, Jupiter in Cancer, very strong Jupiter perhaps in its exaltation. But Jupiter in Cancer is very moralistic. It has ideas about what's right for other countries, regime change, Jupiter in Cancer. And so what was going on for America when the coup actually happened? So here is here's the chart of the USA in the middle, and there's a coup on the outer wheel. So look at Chiron. The United States had a Chiron return at the time of the coup. Kissinger had a Chiron return when he had his at the time of the coup. That means that Kissinger's Chiron was in the same place as America's Chiron. So I think this is telling us about Chiron. I think Chiron is perhaps more complicated than we realize, and there is perhaps a malefic side to the way Chiron is working. And Black Moon Lilith, for transiting Black Moon Lilith, was opposition America's Mars. America using its Mars to subvert another country, but using it in a sort of in a very devious way. And look at Saturn. Saturn was transiting America's Venus-Jupiter conjunction. Again, supposedly nice, isn't it? Venus-Jupiter in Cancer, but Venus-Jupiter has become something that is very focused on its way of doing things, its idea of harmony, its idea of security. And Saturn conjunct the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in America's chart, perhaps showing all the bad stuff going on. Remember, this was around the time of the Watergate crisis, was about a scandal was about to blow up. So I think that's just something that was going on. Maybe you can see what Chile, in terms of the whole unpleasantness of the Nixon regime. Although was Ford any better? I think Ford seemed to be quite happy with it, but that's the United States' chart. And finally, who was president at the time who was US president? Well, of course, Richard Nixon was US president, so we can't forget Richard Nixon's chart. And so, what was happening to Richard Nixon at the time of the coup. So Richard Nixon had his Uranus at 2 degrees 42 Aquarius, and you can see that he had Jupiter conjunct his Uranus. So Uranus is him stirring things up, a regime change, Jupiter conjunct Uranus. He must have been delighted to have heard about what was going on in Chile, and I don't think he probably cared too much about the murders and the tortures and the executions. And he had the sun was crossing his ascendant also at the time of it. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say about Chile. And I thought that's something I needed to talk about. 51 years ago, when we all sort of focus on the 9/11 in 2001, but there was a 9/11 in Chile 51 years ago, and I think that's something that we do need to discuss. Plus, I think the astrology is really interesting, and I think that Salvador Allende's solar returns are quite spectacular. And also, we get the idea, perhaps, that maybe we can start to see Chiron in a different way. So, a complementary way, but perhaps we need to extend our idea about what Chiron can actually mean. So anyway, I'm really sorry that there are no forecasts for the 12 signs. Really sorry about that, but there was a technical fault. I couldn't do anything about it, and I just didn't have the time to do them again. So sorry about that. Still, if you did happen to like this video, I'd be really happy I'd certainly be happy if you like the video. I'd be even happier if you were to indicate that you like this video. And if you're not subscribed, I would be over the moon if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thank you for listening, and I will be back tomorrow. And tomorrow I will have the 12 signs. Don't worry. And I'm really my apologies for the omission today. Anyway, I will talk to you again tomorrow.